First of all, happy Earth Day, everyone. Very exciting that you're here with us on this particular day as we celebrate Earth Forward. And of course, as we all know, Earth Day is every day. But with the Earth Forward events sponsored by the Maricopa County Community Colleges, it's a focus on education, adaptation, resilience, technology for all of humanity. So it's a beautiful acronym for us to understand the importance of moving forward and making the better decisions each and every day towards a more sustainable future. So this particular event is being hosted by the Arizona State University College of Global Futures. You have a team in place for you. If you have any questions after the event, I'm Bridget Bavasset. I graduated from the School of Sustainability and currently teach some of the study abroad courses. I work with my incredible colleague, Nicole Herrera. And Michael, would you like to say a few words, Michael?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. We are very, very excited for you to join us today. And one thing to please keep in mind is this presentation is for you. So if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. You can either unmute yourself. I will be manning the chat section also. So you can either, again, you can unmute yourself or write it in the chat and we'll get it in. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions, okay?
Tonight's presentation is dinner for 9.6 billion. I hope that you all brought your forks. I'm your speaker, Bridget Bavasset, and again, I work with the College of Global Futures teaching some courses, and I'll give some examples of food challenges in some of the countries where I've taken students before. We're going to look at both global food supply challenges and solutions. So just some of the challenges we're going to address here because there's a lot. But we're going to look at population, climate change, policy and governance, farmland loss, and deforestation issues. And then just look at one of the solutions that's out there, and those are benefits for urban farming, using less water and fewer greenhouse gas emissions when we grow and eat food locally, as well as needing fewer pesticides and fertilizers and just better air quality for our cities. So to start with the population issue, back in 1960, human population first hit 3 billion. By 1999, we had more than doubled the number of humans on this planet in just 39 years. Does that sound a little crazy? Did we double our water supply? No. Did we double land space to grow food? No, we're actually losing land space. By the time we get to the year 2050, we're going to be at a capacity of 9.6 billion humans on this planet. That's our lifetime. That's not just some future problem for our kids and grandkids. This will be us in about 29 years. And at 9.6 billion, each of us is going to need the basics of water and food and land space. But we also need medicines and we need affordable housing and we need jobs. All of the things that contribute to quality of life for humans, we're crowded. So the whole point of studying sustainability and innovation is to make sure that when we get there, we're going to be okay. If we're running out of a resource, let's find an alternative or let's find an innovation to help us move forward so that we all have the things that we need and want for quality of life. By the way, when I'm in a class teaching at Mesa Community College, as well as Arizona State, often I put up this website of Worldometers, world population, and I start at the beginning of class. And by the end of class, everybody says, oh my gosh, we just gained another 20,000 people on this planet or more. But right now today, I checked for Earth Day, the Earth is at 7.86 billion people. So some of the reasons that we're seeing problems with food production include climate change. So if you look at this map, these are the countries that are known for producing coffee and cocoa. And this is kind of in a belt, mostly between Tropic of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer, and those climates are drier and hotter. So it's more difficult for these countries to produce those crops that are important to their economy. As an example, I took students to Cuba. The first time we went was in 2017. We went back again in 2018. And when we met with Cubans and went to coffee plantations on that island, they said they were at 30% production. because it's drier and hotter, and they were struggling with how to grow these crops. Not just the temperature and the moisture, but there's also bugs that become more prevalent in a drier, hotter atmosphere, and that was also causing problems for their crops. Policy and governance also plays a role in food supply all over the world. So as an example for Cuba, we've had a US trade embargo on that country, mostly ever since the early 1960s until now. There was a small opening when we opened up trade with Cuba in 2016, and then that closed again by 2018. But when the Soviet Union left Cuba in 1991, they'd been there for almost 30 years, they took with them all of their agricultural equipment. So now you have an island nation, and other countries aren't trading with Cuba, not the United States and not our allies. The only country that was trading with Cuba when we were there in 2017 was Venezuela. They were exchanging energy, oil. But Venezuela is in a world of hurt now. So Cuba doesn't even have that opportunity to have a trading partner. So they have this island. They don't have big ranches with cattle. The Cubans are not allowed to be in boats to go fishing. It was very strange to be on an island nation and to not see any boats out in the Caribbean Sea. The Castro regime wanted Cubans to stay on the land, so they would just stand on piers and throw their fishing lines out as far as they could. So here's one of the challenges. When that window opened in 2016 under the Barack Obama administration, we were going to start opening trade with Cuba. Cruise ship lines signed contracts very quickly. They wanted to be able to come bring tourists to Havana. This is a great thing for the Cuban economy to have tourists coming in and spending money in your country. This was good. The challenge was Cubans had difficulty feeding themselves. How are they going to feed all the tourists? And that's a lot of the income that they wanted, was serving us meals and, dinners by the ocean, and that to be able to do that by having such a limited food supply. This is an example of what each Cuban family had. My students stayed with host families, and one of the moms showed a picture of this, and my student took a photo of it. These ration books called libretas give basic food supplies from the Castro government. So basically, every Cuban would get one chicken leg a month, one egg a month. Obviously, this doesn't allow you to get all the calories you need. So there were lots of black markets. The family I stayed with in Havana had chickens in their house, and they traded eggs with their neighbor who grew mangoes. They're always helping each other, but it's difficult to be able to have enough food on an island for your tourists as well as for your folks. And this is one of their challenges. We saw the same climate change problem in Costa Rica. These are my students on a coffee plantation. And I don't know if you can tell, but there's coffee trees in the background. And part of our volunteer experience was planting guava and avocado trees in between the coffee trees. And the reasoning for this is because of climate change, there was a bug that had started eating their coffee, but this bug doesn't like avocados and doesn't like guavas. So they kind of stayed away from the coffee plantation after the nutrient cycling in the soil was happening. And also in Costa Rica, one of their solutions was to move coffee plantations up into the cloud forest. This picture is taken in the cloud forest. It's cooler up there. It's a little bit more humid, and the coffee's doing well. Back on the older plantations where the climate change is so much drier and hotter, those coffee plantations are also at about 30% production. So you can see how strategies to try to adapt while we're trying to mitigate climate change to make it less vicious, so to speak. Another way that we look at how climate change is affecting food production around the world, in June of 2022, the School of Sustainability and the School for the Future of Innovation and Society have a program going to study in Cambodia and Vietnam. And we're looking at rising sea levels. As our oceans warm, saltwater expands as it warms. So all of the rising tides, high tides are higher, low tides are higher because that salt water is expanding as it warms. We're starting to see flooding in the Mekong Delta. So for both Cambodia and Vietnam, seawater comes in and floods out the rice plantations, and it's causing problems. Now, one thing that our research before going there has shown is that some of these farmers are switching from rice to shrimp. The shrimp do well, whether it's the saltwater or the freshwater environment, they adapt, but the rice doesn't do as well with this flooding. So good that they're still producing a food. Shrimp is a great protein source. The challenge is shrimp is obviously more expensive. We need to have countries producing rice because it's one of the 3 main foods on our planet. So we've got to have good rice production. And if we have challenges growing it in countries that historically provided it, this is a huge problem. We also look at how food supply is affected by deforestation. So much of the Amazon biome is going to be without trees in just about 9 years because of the logging. Some of this is because they're logging for lumber. There's also urban development as cities build out. They're trying to get transportation routes into a lot of areas in the Amazon, basically roads, and they're clearing rainforest for roads. They feel that cattle ranching might benefit some of the countries such as Brazil. Brazil has an incredibly strong food shortage right now, and people are hungry. And they feel that maybe if they burn the rainforest and they start growing grass for cattle, they can feed their people in Brazil as well as have an economic driver of steaks to export beef, planting soy plantations. Some of the rainforest is being depleted just to have hydropower dams. But the Amazon is considered the lungs of the earth. Again, this is Earth Day, Earth Week, Earth Year, Earth Lifetime. The lungs of the earth, we need to protect the Amazon rainforest. We have to understand how this hits people economically in Brazil and hits society there. But at the same token, we need to find that win-win-win where we can get a solution that's good for the economy, good for people, and good for the environment. This is just an example, and I'm going to toggle back and forth here. Coffee plantations now and in 2050, you can see how they're being depleted. Part of this is due to development, but part of it is also due to climate change. So just to also show you an example of time lapse, many of you may have grown up here in the Phoenix metro area. My parents moved to Chandler, Arizona when I was a kid, and the population of Chandler was 38,000. I think we're maybe 10 times that now. But you can see on this map, this is an aerial view of Chandler back in 1989, and then just 20 years later. So you can see how all that farmland, and some of you may remember that, or remember a citrus grove that may have been down the street from where you live in Phoenix or New River or Gilbert or wherever you currently live. There may have been a farm or citrus nearby, citrus grove, and now it's just a housing development or a shopping mall or another road. This is how our cities are developing. They're building out. And we have mega cities all over the world. A mega city is 10 million people or more. And whenever there's a mega city, the chances of a farm being anywhere nearby is very minuscule. So how do you feed 10 million people in a city when the nearest farm could be hundreds of miles away? We bring a lot of speakers to the College of Global Futures, and Tom Vilsack came twice during the Obama administration. He's now Secretary of Agriculture for President Biden. So we hope to get him back out here again to talk to students. He said a couple of things that were pretty hard hitting. One thing that's a part of our food problems in the United States, almost half of it just ends up in a landfill. Do you remember the days when we could go to restaurants? I don't know if any of you ever ate at Claim Jumper over there at Arizona Mills. Delicious food, but the portions were huge. Oh my gosh, they plates. I mean, you could basically feed 4 people on one plate of food. They were very generous. So when you think about how much food in restaurants we were just sending back to the kitchen, or it was basically going into a trash can, a lot of that happens in the United States with our restaurants being very generous with food supply. Another part of this is simply the same thing in our house. We end up throwing away a lot of food. Fewer Americans are farming. I mean, less than 1% of Americans farm. It used to be at the turn of the previous century in 1900, more than a third of Americans made their living farming and ranching. So much of us were producing food. You can see how that steadily dropped, and now it's less than 1%. So how do you feed that carrying capacity, that 9.6 billion people, it's just 29 years from now? How do you feed that many people when 3 out of 4 of us will be living in a city of 10 million or more? So to give you a visual, New York City is not a mega city yet. So imagine on this call, 3 out of 4 of us will be living in a city larger than New York City. One of the great innovations that's already up and running around the world is called vertical farming. That building on the right is just an image. That building doesn't exist yet. The building on the left is in Tokyo. This is an example of how we can grow food up the sides of buildings. There's a lot of this around the world. In the United States, Chicago has 2.5 million square feet of urban farming. Through rooftop gardens, through vertical farming. They have a terminal at O'Hare Airport in Chicago that's growing food for the restaurants at the airport. And when we grow food vertically, lots of benefits. One is that the crops are insulating the buildings, so they use less energy. They're cooler in the summer, they're warmer in the winter, and saving energy supply in a huge city is so important. As more businesses can decrease consumption, that's a good thing. Another great advantage with this is that we don't need chemicals, pesticides, or fertilizers. Because this is all vertical farming, it's water-based, it's aquaponics, so there's no soil. And some of you that are in my class understand that when we have all those farming chemicals out in the world, they end up getting washed, like in the Mississippi Delta. Those chemicals get washed in the Mississippi, end up in the Gulf of Mexico. There's an entire area of the Gulf of Mexico that has what's called eutrophication, just so much chemicals. There's the algae overtakes it, and there's no oxygen, and basically no fish can survive. We can avoid that with our rivers and our bays and our gulfs and our oceans to get rid of those chemicals. Another great advantage, we can grow food using only 10% of the water that traditional farming takes. We can save 90% of agricultural water supply to do this. Just yesterday on the news, the day before Earth Day, this was April 21st, they were talking about the Colorado River water allocations. 7 states pull that river from the Colorado River. They're diminishing our allocations again because of the decreased water supply. All 7 states are going to get even less than we take now. And we take so much that we've taken a water source away from our neighbor in Mexico. Colorado River used to flow all the way through Mexico into the Sea of Cortez, and our neighbors in Mexico use that river as irrigation for farming and for people and hydroelectric power and industry. But we have taken that water with 7 states taking their allocation. You get to the border of Arizona and Mexico, that river is usually dry. So one more benefit about urban farming that's so important, growing food locally can decrease the greenhouse gas emissions that occur when we're transporting food. You may have heard that a lot of food that is on your plate traveled 1,200 miles to get to you. That's the average. If you're eating strawberries out of season, chances are they came up from Argentina. I mean, we've always been importing and exporting foods and driving it across the country, but that's a lot of emissions. When you support local farmers, local farmer markets, and local co-ops, you're helping decrease greenhouse gas emissions, and that helps us defeat climate change issues. As an example of urban farming, these are my students in Cuba. We went to a farm. If you notice in those gardens, you see some upside down plastic bottles. There's a blue one, a yellow one, a white one. When I saw those old bottles, I thought that these were maybe irrigation systems or something. I asked the farmer about it and he grinned and he said, well, actually, because of climate change, there's been a new bug that was eating his food. So he puts those bottles into his garden and he coats the bottles with oil. So now the bugs are attracted to the yellow, the blue, the white bottles. And as soon as they land on it, they get caught in the oil and they stop eating his plants because they die on the bottles. Kind of an ingenious way to take some trash and to kind of recycle it into being a pest control issue. There's going to be a course in May of 2022, if the borders open up from this pandemic. The Dean of the College of Global Futures and I are teaching a class in Singapore and Malaysia. Singapore is one of those countries that has so much urban farming and urban greenery. It's just amazing. This is one of the leaders in the world in terms of how to economically benefit your city by having locally grown food, how to decrease all the greenhouse gas emissions. It's also called food security. When you've got it locally sourced, you're less likely to be affected by problems if suddenly you can't get food from a country that you depend on. They were talking in the news yesterday about North Korea. The North Koreans are having a severe food shortage because their usual supply from China has been stopped because of COVID. So as you can imagine, all the challenges that exist at North Korea to begin with, suddenly adding to their problems is getting food into their system. Whenever you can have locally grown and sourced food, it's so much better. There's a beautiful talk that we videotaped last summer, and please feel free to email me after this lecture and I can get it to you. Professor Kathleen Merrigan talked about how COVID disrupted the food chain. It unraveled the food distribution system in the United States. You may remember back in April when farmers were dumping milk into the ground. Dairy farmers did not have the transportation systems running because of the pandemic shutdown, and they didn't have refrigeration for all that milk. They needed to continue milking the cows so that that source wasn't going to be depleted. And yet they were just milking and dumping it, knowing that just a few hundred miles away, people had empty grocery stores, but they just couldn't get the milk to them. These are all things that we need to consider when we're looking for a stronger food supply system. In fact, there is now a Bachelor of Science degree in food systems. If this is something you're interested in and you want to check it out, this degree came about because students were interested in careers in food and agricultural sectors. This is something that's been going to be for the rest of humanity. We have to eat. So obviously knowing how we can have better food systems, how we can grow it, the genetically modified foods, are those good or bad? There's so many ways that you can study food systems. You know, if you're looking at this to continue your education, science of food system, there's different areas. There's leadership, procurement, global engagement. There's the public health and nutrition, business and innovation is a big part of this, policy and governance, and of course, science of the ecosystem services. If you're interested in College of Global Futures, it's going to be a transdisciplinary degree focused on solving real problems with real world experience and having a degree that you can use out in the world, because of course we've all got it. And this is just kind of an overview of all different options that you have, including a 4+1. So when you come out of the community college system, if you've got your associates and you want to transfer into a 4-year university, you can transfer in and maybe get a master's degree as well as finish out a bachelor's degree within that 3-year period of coming in. So these are things you can talk to an advisor about and get more information. The team that I work with Nicole and Michael, we're always happy to answer any questions. And we're doing pretty great on time in the sense that I want to check in to see if anyone has any questions. You're welcome to unmute. Or Michael, if you see anything in chat, feel pleased to just share that with me.
Not yet. All's quiet out here, but I'm sure they have lots of questions.
I have a question. With the urban farming, even though it'll solve where to find land for crops, what do you do with all the meat that people would eat and the agriculture? You can't raise cows very easily in the city for meat. Is this for when people are all vegans or vegetarians? Or?
That's a great question. And you just made me think of a cow on the roof of the Chicago Trade Center. Obviously, I have carnivores in my family. I understand that's a good question. I think that with ranching, with cattle, we're still going to have them out. The same thing with sheep, with goats. There's still going to be farmlands and ranches for that. But it's a great point that when these cities get so big, it's harder to get meat into them. I remember I was in Tokyo, and that's 34 million people. And we have a guest on the call who's lived in Japan and may want to shed some light on this. But I remember all the restaurants just had amazing seafood choices. We did have meat choices. And is it called Kobe beef? Is that the fancy thing that carnivores love? You know, there's definitely options, but no, those were higher priced compared to the seafood offerings. So maybe, Olga, it comes down to like a price issue. If it's something that's harder to get, of course, they're going to charge more for it. Does that make sense?
Hey, Bridget?
Yes.
We have a question from Elena she just wants more information about the 4+1 program, please.
Oh, absolutely. So with the 4+1, that's like getting a bachelor's degree plus a graduate degree in 5 years. Normally, a graduate degree takes 2 years, but when you do a 4+1, you start taking graduate classes when you're still a senior earning your bachelor's degree. So if you're coming from one of our incredible community colleges that we have in our system, you're coming in, maybe you've already got an associate's degree or you've got credits, you start working on a 4+1, you're going to be taking junior and senior level classes. And as you're a senior, you'll be adding in those grad courses and then finishing out your last year with us with a master's degree. And specifically, there is a Master of Science and Technology policy. There's also the Global Technology and Development Master of Science. So you have those choices. It's an awesome program. I wish they'd had that when I was around, because it saves you a year of tuition and a year of studying because you're wrapping it into your senior year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, she also wants to know about how do you apply for the 4+1?
Oh, perfect. When you're applying into the program, you apply for your bachelor's degree program, and you can see there's 5 choices there. In sustainability, there's a BS in science, a BS in sustainability, a Bachelor of Arts in sustainability, and then the sustainable food systems. The Future of Innovation Society has a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Arts in Innovation and Society. So when you pick one of those 5 degrees, you apply for that. And as soon as you go in for your advising, you tell them, I'm looking at the 4+1, and they can immediately map it out for you so that you're getting the classes that you need to earn that master's degree. That was a great question.
All right, now the questions are rolling in now. So from Brandon, he wants to know, how helpful could individual gardening at home be in solving the food supply issue? I think about the victory gardens during wartime.
Beautiful question and very helpful. As individuals, like right now, what did I say? We are 7.8 billion of us on this planet. Yeah, I'm just one person on 7.8 billion. Every choice you make on a daily basis is a collective difference. If I'm drinking water out of a glass every day, that's 365 plastic bottles I haven't opened. Everything collectively adds up. So when you're growing your own food, you're not driving to the grocery store to pick up food. You're not having it brought in from other states or other countries and having those greenhouse gas emissions. I know that some of us are limited. My friends in New York City don't even have a balcony. So it's harder, but you can actually grow indoor herb gardens and at least have vegetables of lettuce and herbs and have those. There's always something you can grow to an extent. And if you have a yard, that's fantastic. You might check out, we were just talking about this recently. In Mesa, there's a family that converted a swimming pool into an entire garden with chickens. And they've got aquaponics, they've got fish in there, they're growing food. It's called, is it called, somebody help me out here. Is it
Garden
called
pool.
I'm sorry?
Garden pool.
Yes, thank you. The garden pool. And that was just a family that moved in and thought, hey, let's do this with the swimming pool. And it's very cool. So the more that you do able to grow your own food, it definitely helps in the long run. Of course it does collectively. So thank you for asking that.
All right, the next question is from Olivia. She wants to know what's the main reason that we haven't seen vertical agriculture being introduced into large cities? This is the first time I'm hearing of it, but it sounds like a great idea that is working for other countries.
Exactly. So let me give you a specific Phoenix example. I do some work for a company downtown Phoenix. It's an 11-story building. And our facilities manager tells us that the building was not designed to support vertical farming. He said this building was built in 1961. So we have a zoning problem in the sense that maybe you're not allowed to have food sources in an area. There's also the structural concern for some buildings. The interesting thing is rooftop gardens are not that heavy. When you think of how heavy air conditioning equipment is, I mean, that's tons, right? Rooftop gardens can be easily managed and not be a problem. One of our problems here in the Phoenix area is simply the heat that we have. We can strategically place rooftop gardens so that other buildings shade another rooftop, a lower rooftop downtown. That's one of the ideas, to strategically place these so that in the hot summer, we can get shade from the existing building next door to help keep that food shaded in the hot afternoon. We have vertical farming in Phoenix at the Sheraton Hotel downtown. On the 4th floor, they have a patio garden. We have it at the light rail that's right at the stadium at Arizona State University. There's like a 6-story transportation center. There's a whole roof garden up there that most people don't even know about. So it's slowly happening. And we do see a lot of it in Chicago. We're seeing a lot of it in Boulder, Colorado. We're seeing rooftop farming and urban farming in Santa Monica. So some cities are picking up on it, but that's a great question. It's policy, it's zoning, and then it's just structural integrity of existing buildings.
All right, the next question from Anne. Since farming takes so much of our water in Arizona, are farmers corporations trying to change their crops or farming techniques?
They unfortunately will end up being forced to, because we just lost some of our Colorado River allocation. Some of our water comes from the snow melt in the mountains to the east of us, comes through the canal system. We actually lose a lot of that to evaporation because much of the Arizona Canal is open. If we put that canal underground, we would lose less to evaporation. But as you know, we have caliche soil, hard to dig here. And it's about $1 million per mile to bury a cable or to bury a canal.
I have an idea that my dad made up for covering the canal, is putting solar panels over the top of the canal to produce electricity and eliminate evaporation.
That would be fantastic. That would be smart because it would help cover the canals and you're producing electricity. That would be a great idea. Is your dad going to run for mayor? Because this is something that we need to look at. Better yet, governor. We need to have these ideas as a statewide basis. The other thing that farmers look at in our desert, it's better if farmers are doing the flood irrigation. It seems as if that's more water that they're using. But when we use those big sprinkler systems that you may remember, so much went to evaporation. It really was inefficient and it could be blown onto a highway. Flood irrigation is better for us, but a lot of what our farmers are adapting to is trying to grow crops that need less water. That's one of the things that we may be forced into until we figure out better ways. And again, if we do more of this aquaponics and hydroponics, we can reuse that water system. We're only using 10% of what would it take if we had it in a soil base.
She has another question, just a follow-up. Is there any way to renovate the existing buildings to allow for vertical agriculture?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So one thing to keep in mind, a lot of vertical farming can be so easily done with an existing balcony. If you've got a balcony, you can plant food on the balcony and just kind of grow it right there. It's kind of the outside. It'll protect your inside of your apartment or your condominium. That's one option. You also have a beautiful thing that France did. The entire country of France made a national law that every new building constructed in France must have either a solar roof or a garden roof. Either way, they're going to decrease energy consumption in France, because with the solar roof, of course, they're producing electricity. Garden roof, they're insulating the buildings and using less energy and growing food. So that's a beautiful policy now for an entire country, that everything that's being constructed new. In terms of adapting existing buildings, it's kind of just looking at the structural integrity of the building, which is something that engineers can do. And they can say, yeah, we can support a system up here. Think of all the hotels that have a swimming pool on their roof. Well, goodness gracious, if you can have a swimming pool, of course you can have a farming colony with some aquaponics up there. That's less weight than a swimming pool. Great questions.
I also hold of green roofs, where it's kind of like native wildlife habitat that I've heard like that can really help birds, wildlife in the cities have habitat and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I saw something interesting in Holland. They made a wildlife corridor crossing over the Autobahn. I mean, basically, we have to understand wildlife and their habitats and how important they are for our ecosystems. It's surprising how much biodiversity there is in a city, and yet we keep paving over everything instead of what we call adaptive reuse. That's where you take an existing building and renovate it for what you need instead of building something brand new. In fact, there's a talk Friday morning at 11 o'clock, a corporate sustainability talk for Earth Forward. They're going to be talking about examples of adaptive reuse as a way to use what we've already poured for concrete. There's a question in the Q&A section too, from Karen.
Yes.
What career paths stem from the Bachelor of Arts and Sustainability degree, and what can we as citizens do to affect policy change for sustainability purposes? Okay, on the first one, sustainability is a transdisciplinary field. So there's a wide variety of jobs that are out there because it's transdisciplinary. There are jobs at utility companies, of course. There are jobs at Dell, Intel, Tesla. We have 3 alumni working at Disney World, because you're thinking about all the people that come into a big amusement park and the trash that creates, and how can you make it more sustainable and green? There's just so many choices because it's transdisciplinary. And they're going to talk about some of the specific jobs that transfer students are already heading towards, and we'll show a map of that. And also, you're welcome to email me or Michael, Karen, or Nicole, and we can send you the slide to show you the different jobs, because there's a lot out there. And then in terms of affecting policy change, just think of what Greta Thunberg is doing today, that beautiful young teenager who's been fighting for climate change for years. And a lot of the lobbyists and the politicians, they just are charging full steam ahead without looking at the science or the common sense. That was her plea yesterday, was just look at the science and use your common sense and what we can do. So obviously vote, of course. If you can be active with any groups where you're just promoting awareness. Our challenge in the United States, Karen, is civil discourse. We feel that if I'm in a different political party than someone, that we're just going to fight and argue. The real challenge is to find the common ground, because we all want clean water. We all want healthy food. It's just, how do we get there? And without arguing or fighting over it. And also, choosing organic food or non-organic make any differences? It actually does. And be careful about organic. If you think about it, arsenic is organic, but that's no good, right? Organic is applied to food that's grown without the harsh chemicals and fertilizers. That makes a big difference, not only for you, because it's healthier to not ingest those, but for the environment. When I mentioned Cuba, I don't think I mentioned this, but Cuba had one of the healthiest coral reefs in the world when I was there in 2017. And we were curious about that. Like, how is their coral reef so healthy when all over the world it's bleaching out? One of the reasons is that when the Soviet Union left in 1991 and Cuba had to become completely organic and use natural pesticides, like the guy putting oil on a plastic bottle, they don't have a runoff going into their Caribbean Sea that's hurting the coral. So same thing, if we have organic food, we're gonna have less of those chemicals out there. There's, the risk to that is simply that the farmers will say, yeah, but I could lose my entire crop in 1 year. I have to spray these pesticides. We've got to change our thinking and maybe do less monoculture farming. Like if there's only one crop of corn and there's a particular bug that eats corn, well, of course, that farmer's luck for the year. But if he's planting different crops, which is a little harder to manage, but it's like diversifying a portfolio. You've got better chance of making money for that year. These are great questions, you guys. And every time you make a choice, something as simple as buying your food not packaged in plastic makes a huge difference. And I know that's incredibly difficult. Plastic is almost everything. I think the last mayonnaise jar I could get as a glass jar was Kraft, and now it's plastic. I mean, it's just difficult to find food that you can buy, but whenever you can, it makes a big difference in the long run so that we're not contributing to plastic waste through our food system. And some of the reality, if you're running a marathon, you don't want somebody handing you a glass bottle while you're running by. But maybe we go back to the paper cups and not use the plastic so much. That helps us with those tiny everyday choices collectively making a difference.
All right, so Brandon's question is in. Oh, it's a two-parter. So in terms of food waste, in your opinion, who is most responsible? Producers, distributors, retailers, or consumers? And how do we stop wasting so much?
I love that question. Oh my gosh, that is a great question. So I'm going to back it up and move it up the supply chain. So as a consumer, of course, take your portion that you should eat and don't take more than you're supposed to. But then that speaks to the restaurant. You're ordering food and they're going to bring you that order. You can't just say, I'll just take half of it. You have to be 65 years old for the senior portion or something. You have to understand the restaurant's going to serve you. I often take to-go stuff with me when I go to restaurants, and it embarrasses my children, but I'll take out foil and I immediately wrap up part of my food and just put it in my purse. But you can do that as an option to not waste food, because restaurants are going to serve what they think is what's going to attract more customers. So then we go back to the kitchens, moving up that supply chain. In a restaurant, they have to try to predict how many people are going to come in, how many customers, what's going to be a popular dish, what are they going to cook and have too much of. There was a point at the School of Sustainability many years ago, I think this was in like the year 2009, where a student had an idea to take a truck that could go to all the restaurants and get the food that they cooked and never served and take it straight to homeless shelters. So this sounds like a perfect solution of, here's a lasagna cooked at Macaroni Grill that, they never cut into. It's fresh, it's new. Let's just take it and donate it to the homeless shelter. The problem is the United States is a litigious society. We're always suing everybody. So a restaurant doesn't want to give away free food if somebody in a homeless shelter is going to say, oh, this made me sick, I'm going to sue you. You see how that something like that becomes a problem? That's a sad way to look at it. There's other ways that we have found ways of, like wrapped food that's in a store and maybe it's going to expire in 2 days, and maybe get that donated where people can enjoy it right away. Solutions like that. When you mentioned in your question about, is it also responsibility of the farmers and distributors? I think it's less their responsibility, because farmers are going to grow as much as they can, because farmers have a lot of expenses and they need to try to recoup the cost of a harvester or however they're picking their food or getting it to market. They're producing as much as they can. the distributors should be aware of where they're taking it. If they're taking all of it to a distribution center in Arkansas, when maybe people just 100 miles in this other direction could need it or use it, well, then that's not very smart planning either. So I think that could be a career. Now that you think about it, and food distribution of mapping out how to effectively get fresh food to sources where it needs to be, because we do have food deserts all over the world. Phoenix has, I think, 42 food deserts. That's defined as living somewhere and your nearest grocery store could be like more than a mile and a half away. So you can only get fast food at gas station unless you're traveling somewhere. We need to definitely be addressing those issues for distribution. Okay. I'm seeing more and more job opportunities coming up as we're talking. This is so great.
Thomas also has a resource that he posted for local restaurants that implemented sustainability principles.
Excellent.
So yeah, a local resource to use also. That's great.
Yeah, it's the Blue Watermelon Project, and they're just a great group of chefs that implemented sustainability principles in their restaurant here in the Valley. So
thank you, Thomas. And that it's so important to support those restaurants that are actively looking at this. So whenever you have a choice, if there's a restaurant that's going to give you a coffee in a styrofoam cup, but you can go somewhere else and get the paper cup, support the paper cup restaurant.
Brigitte, one question that I had is in regards to, obviously, we're talking a lot about the United States and what we can do locally here. But when we're looking at, for example, the largest consumer of pork in the world is China. And do you see any, measurements and any push to maybe get people in countries that are producing or consuming a lot of meat to consume less?
That's a great question, Thomas. So some of the things that we look at with beef and with pork is how much water it takes to create a pound of beef or a pound of pork. You're thinking of all the water that cow drinks during its lifetime, all the water for the grass that grows for that cow to eat, and then the processing of that steak product. There's a lot of water used for cows and for porks, less for chickens, and then of course the least is for vegetables. When we start looking at how it affects our water supply, and countries that are having trouble with water supply need to understand that. We look at the greenhouse gas emissions. About 1/6 of all greenhouse gas emissions on planet Earth are agriculture related. And a large part of that is just the methane from cattle industry. So when we realize how that's contributing to climate change, one of the things that we've suggested in the United States is like a meatless Monday. If you have one day of the week, you're not eating meat. Culturally, it's hard to promote something like that. My family are all Texas ranchers, they think I'm crazy. But there's a beautiful TED Talk by a young man that says he's a weekday vegetarian. So he basically eats fruits and vegetables all week, and then he has a hamburger on a Saturday or something. There's different ways that we can cut back on it. Like you said, Thomas, culturally it's harder, but I think, and this is a dangerous thing to say, but if the price is higher, you won't eat as much, or you may start to learn to love maybe some of the alternatives that are out there. It's tough to make it an economic solution because there are people that are in low-income areas that protein sources, and maybe the only source of protein they can get is if they go buy a steak.
Yeah.
I haven't eaten meat in so many decades. It's hard for me to even, talk about this, but we have to recognize those cultural differences. So when you mention like with China and all the pork products in China, it's difficult unless they directly associate it to the water consumption, the energy consumption of that industry, and then the greenhouse gas emissions from it.
Thank you.
By the way, go ahead. I saw you unmute.
No, I just said thank you.
You're welcome. There's a dairy farm in the Midwest where they've captured all the methane from the dairy farm. They're actually powering all the people that live like within a 100-mile radius. It's kind of cool. that they found the way to capture that methane and make it a power source that they're renewing. But we need to be aware of how meat consumption affects our planet, Earth Day, and every day, quite frankly.
And also make the alternatives to meats more appealing, like Impossible Burger, like plant-based meats that taste and have the same texture that people are addicted to. So that way people will still have the meat flavor, but in an environmentally friendly way.
Great point. And I've taken my carnivore friends to Green. That's one of the restaurants that serve the mock meats, trying to trick them. And sometimes it works and sometimes not. But, if we have more opportunities, if this is something you're passionate about and you believe in, just be sure you support those businesses, the ones that are working to reduce consumption of meat. Support them as best as you can, because I think culturally, I don't really see a future where we have a planet where nobody eats meat. It's hard to picture. And of course, there's other ecosystem consequences if that's completely gone. So there's a balance there that we need to be aware of.
And also, if you could culturally grow meat, like grow meat from cells instead of needing a whole animal.
Yes. I talked about this once in Sustainable World. Scientists, and this, must have been 10 years ago, grew a meat patty in the lab. It took them like 30 days, and they wanted it to look like meat, and they wanted to cook it and have it taste like meat. And when they grew this thing from just a cell, they were asking the scientists, okay, who wants to grill this and take a bite out of it and tell us how it tastes? And of course, nobody's raising their hand. And I said, okay, so what if they offered you a $10,000 bonus on your paycheck? And then everyone said, yeah, I'll try it. And the guy did try it, said, well, it's going to need a lot of ketchup, so whatever they grew that first time that they tried this, it wasn't as much of a success. But there's ways to make it. I think some of those products are delicious. Any other questions from folks? Oh yeah, I love that book, Thomas. Michael Pollan's book. He's an amazing speaker. He's come to be a guest speaker on campus before. He's a great guy. But Omnivore's Dilemma, that's a great book. So thanks for showing that. And slowfoodphoenix.org. I'm so glad you shared that. That's the Blue Watermelon Project you talked about.
Here's another book, Diet for a New America. That's a good one too.
Oh yes, absolutely. So thank you so much for joining us.